They called them something that sounded like thunder. Sturmtruppen, storm troops. Not because they smiled politely at the enemy, because they inspired a kind of dread that didn't go away. World War I, the Western Front. Soldiers from the United States, Britain, and France filled the trenches. Canadians fought beside them. They learned the same drills. They breathed the same mud. They shared the same fear. But ask German soldiers who kept them awake at night, and the answer wasn't always what you'd expect. It wasn't the Americans they feared most. It was the Canadians. Listen to why. April 1917. Vimy Ridge, France. For 2 years, British and French units had hammered at that strip of high ground. Countless men, countless charges. Failure after failure. The ridge remained German. Machine gun nests like teeth. Artillery positions carved into the earth. Deep tunnels and fortified emplacements that turned attackers into targets. Everyone told you the ridge couldn't be taken. It was a fortress, a trap, a place where brave men were chewed up and spat out. Then the Canadian Corps arrived. But the Canadians didn't show up and simply rush the line. They did something different. They studied it like an exam they couldn't fail. They reconstructed it. On the training grounds back behind their lines, they built an exact mock-up of the German defenses, trenches, dugouts, barbed wire, and the slope of the ridge itself. They walked the terrain until their boots memorized every foot of it. They rehearsed the assault again and again. They drilled until timing became instinct. They mapped the enemy positions with a level of detail that looked obsessive. Every gun, every bunker, every communication trench was recorded. Artillery wasn't tasked to shell the enemy in a broad sense. It was choreographed to move forward with the infantry, a creeping, machine-like advance measured in yards and minutes. On April 9th, 1917, under a gray, snow-lace sky, they put that plan into action. Artillery lifted and fell with surgical precision. The barrage advanced in set shifts. The guns walked forward in timed stages. Men followed behind the explosions, not crawling at a distance, but moving in synchrony with their own artillery steps. German crews had maybe seconds, not enough to man their positions, not enough to react to the wave of Canadians surging in. By the close of the first day, the ridge had changed hands. 2 years of attempts. Tens of thousands of casualties. The British and French had failed. The Canadians succeeded in 3 days. But Vimy's story isn't a tidy tale of clever plans and glorious victory alone. There was a brutality braided tightly with that competence. Canadian soldiers in the Great War earned a fearsome reputation, not simply for effectiveness, but for the coldness of their methods. It wasn't official doctrine. It didn't have a neat label in a field manual. Still, accounts and reports make clear, often Canadians didn't take prisoners. On nocturnal trench raids, they'd leave their own line silently, slip over the top, and enter German positions. The work was silent and surgical. Knives, clubs, close quarters killing. No parades of prisoners. No waiting for formal surrenders. The purpose was shock, disruption, and brutally killing. German soldiers coined a phrase to describe the aftermath of those raids. Totenschlaf, the sleep of death. The word itself is a cold thing, a kind of grim acknowledgement that when a Canadian squad came through at night, survival was not guaranteed, even if you weren't manning a gun. One German officer scrawled in his diary words that echoed around bivouacs and barracks. The Canadians are not like other soldiers. They do not fight for glory. They fight to kill. And they are very, very good at it. That line captures a fear that is simple and stark. They weren't feared because they were theatrical. They were feared because they were effective and unyielding. Why? What made the Canadian soldier into this instrument? Start with geography. A large slice of the Canadian Corps came from rural places, farms, forests, logging camps. men accustomed to a life where the rhythm of work and weather hardened them. They were hunters, trappers, men used to tracking a moving thing through wild country. Marksmanship mattered. Patience mattered. Cold weather was routine. When British officers complained about mud that swallowed boots and cold that chilled bone, many Canadians answered with a kind of cultural shrug. This felt like home compared to a Saskatchewan winter. But there was also pride and a chip on the shoulder. Canada, in 1914, was still a young nation, the Dominion within the British Empire. In the halls of some British commands, colonial troops were sometimes dismissed as unseasoned or amateur. Canadian officers and enlisted men felt that slight. They wanted to prove they were more than appendages to an imperial army. They wanted to be counted as equals. So they trained hard. They demanded precise execution. They believed in doing the job and doing it better than anyone expected. That hunger to prove themselves, to win respect, pushed them toward methods that married meticulous planning and relentless execution. After Vimy, the Canadian Corps developed a reputation. If there was a critical objective, a fortified hill, a German position snagging the campaign, British commanders often turned to the Canadians. They were the force you called for the hard, decisive job, and the Canadians delivered. Fast forward to August 1918, the Battle of Amiens. The Canadian Corps struck like a fist and punched through lines that had been thought secure. The German High Command later called that day the Black Day of the German Army. The advance was rapid, coordinated, and dislocating. It signaled a shift in momentum. It was one of the events that helped break the back of German resistance. By the war's end, the Canadian Corps had earned a place as one of the most effective fighting formations on the Western Front. That was a real and costly achievement. Men had trained, bled, and died to make that reputation. But here comes the part many histories glaze over. Canadiens committed va crimes. This is uncomfortable and important to say plainly. The acts were not an official part of Canadian military policy. They were not the subject of posters instructing soldiers on how to behave. Yet contemporary records, testimonies, and investigations document that Canadian troops sometimes shot prisoners, finished off the wounded, and refused surrender when accepting prisoners slowed the advance. One officer, speaking later, admitted a truth that feels like a moral wound. We were told that taking prisoners slowed down the advance. So we didn't take many prisoners. This wasn't isolated boasting. It reflected a practical calculus on the battlefield. Speed mattered. Momentum mattered. Supply lines and the risk of ambush made prisoners a tactical burden. That reality and the fog of war created situations where humanity was discarded for expedience. After the war, there were inquiries, quiet conversations. A handful of officers were questioned, but prosecutions were rare to non-existent. The official narrative that rose after 1918 focused on heroism, deeds of bravery, battlefield craft, and sacrifice. It was a story that nations want, clean, honorable, and inspiring. That story is true, but it is not the entire story. So how do we hold these truths together? Do we glorify the Canadians as invincible shock troops, the men the Germans feared? Or do we reckon with the darker deeds that accompany the victories? We must do both. Celebrating bravery without honesty is a kind of soft denial. Acknowledging atrocity without recognizing courage strips away meaning from sacrifice. The past is a tangle, and truth must be willing to hold the tangle without simplifying it into heroes or monsters alone. Make no mistake, Canadian soldiers displayed extraordinary courage. They endured conditions that would have broken most people. They executed complex operations under enormous pressure. They won battles that others could not. Those feats mattered. They saved lives in the larger war by breaking stalemates and disrupting enemy lines. But war also reveals the worst in people. That is not an excuse. It is a fact. Hunger for victory, humiliation, fear, exhaustion, and the need to survive can lead people to cross lines they never would at home. In the crucible of combat, the rules of society can feel like luxuries you cannot afford. The men who stormed Vimy were farmers, loggers, sons. They were not monsters. They were not sanctified saints. They were human beings capable of heroic endurance and terrible choices. If you stand in front of the Canadian National Vimy Memorial today, the scale of the cost lands with force. Two towering white pylons rise from the fields where the fighting took place. The site is quiet in a way war sites rarely are, designed to honor and to make you reckon. Etched in a stone are the names of 11,285 Canadian soldiers, those who died in France and have no known grave. Each name is a life stopped, a family left with a hole. The memorial doesn't boast about fear or tactics. It doesn't proclaim how the enemy feared them. It simply lists names. That choice tells you something raw and honest, beyond the tactics and reputation. The battlefield is where ordinary lives were extinguished. The Canadian Corps were terrifying because they trained like machines and fought like men who had nothing left to lose. They were disciplined enough to synchronize artillery and infantry like clockwork. They were ruthless enough, on occasion, to treat the enemy with lethal coldness. That combination made them effective. It also left a moral bill. Questions that history will forever debate. So what should we do with that bill? Remember fully. That means telling the parts that make us proud and the parts that trouble us. Teach both. Accept that human beings can be both courageous and culpable. Let memorials be more than comfortable landscapes we visit to feel better about ourselves. Let them be places where we confront what war demands of people, the choices they make, and the cost of those choices. And when someone asks why the Germans fear the Canadians, the answer is simple but complex at once. Because the Canadians planned, trained, and executed ruthlessly and effectively, often with a hunger to prove themselves, and that made them capable of remarkable successes and equally remarkable human failings. If you want to read history that fits neatly into a single emotion, pride, horror, or triumph, you won't get it here. Real history is messy. Vimy is messy. Amiens is messy. The triumph and the brutality sit together like two hands clenched on opposite truths. There's one last, harder point to make. The question of accountability. After 1918, investigations into wartime conduct happened, but they were muted and incomplete. Nations exhausted from war had little appetite to drag their own through public trials. Prosecutions were rare. Memory preferred heroics. Politics demanded unity. That silence matters. It shapes how subsequent generations understand what their forebears did and whether they should feel proud, ashamed, or a bit of both. History without accountability is an incomplete lesson. Honesty with nuance is a better teacher. So yes, call them stormtroops. Call them terrifying. Call them efficient and disciplined. Call them brave. But also call them flawed. Call them responsible for actions that we should acknowledge and examine. The Canadians at Vimy were not one thing or another. They were quite simply human. If you visit that memorial and walk the fields where so many fell, you'll feel the contradiction. Peaceful earth covering violence. Neat white stone listing names that mean everything. It's a space designed to hold both reverence and regret. That's how it should be. War compresses choices into narrow spaces. People who might be kind in peacetime can be brutal in war. People who might be cruel in peacetime can be brave in war. It's not neat. It's not fair. It's reality. So what do we owe these men? We owe them truth. We owe their stories the full measure of complexity, the skill and the savagery, the planning and the panic, the pride, and the crimes. If you want simple answers, history will disappoint. If you want something useful, ask the hard questions. How did training and culture produce this ferocity? Were leaders accountable when lines were crossed? How do we teach future soldiers the discipline to be effective without surrendering humanity? Those questions matter. They matter because Vimy isn't only a moment for 1917. It's a lesson about how militaries form, how societies send citizens to fight, and how the pressure of war reshapes morality. The Canadian Corps left a mark on the Great War. Germany feared them. History remembers that fear. But history must also remember the men behind the fear. Their faces, their choices, their acts. Names on stone. Lives stopped by shell and steel. Actions that won ground and sometimes forfeited mercy. If you want more slices of Canadian history that don't always make the postcards, stories that are sharper, messier, and sometimes uncomfortable, I'll be back next week. The uneasy truth about a Canadian city that became a refuge for organized crime, where lines of law and influence blurred, and where the story of policing meets the story of power. It's a place people whisper about because the RCMP didn't always get their way. See you then.